Have you ever wondered why your emotional reactions sometimes feel so automatic, almost as if they are built into your very DNA? Could it be that your emotional life is not just shaped by your personal experiences, but instead encoded in the very fibers of your being? Imagine, for a moment, if emotions, just like your physical traits such as eye color or height, were passed down through the generations. Embedded within your genetic inheritance, what if your emotional response to stress, love, or even fear wasn't just a result of your upbringing or personal experiences, but a part of your inherited biological code? These are the kinds of questions researchers in the fields of genetics and epigenetics are now exploring. They suggest that our emotional responses might be far more influenced by our ancestors than we have ever imagined. This concept of emotional inheritance is a relatively new and exciting area of scientific research. For centuries, we have thought of emotions as a result of our environment, and our life experiences what happens to us and how we interpret it. But now, emerging scientific evidence is pointing to a fascinating possibility. Our emotions could actually be passed down through generations, much in the same way we inherit physical traits like eye color or height. These new insights are not only changing the way we think about emotions, but they are also challenging the traditional understanding of nature versus nurture. What if it's not just our environment that shapes our emotional lives, but also the emotional experiences of our ancestors? This question opens up an entirely new way of understanding how we feel, how we react, and how much control we truly have over our emotional landscape. The core idea behind this concept is that emotional responses might be embedded in our genetic code, passed down through generations, much like other traits such as skin tone or susceptibility to certain diseases. This doesn't mean that we're born with predetermined emotional reactions to every situation, but rather that our emotional wiring could be influenced by the experiences of those who came before us. Imagine a scenario where your great-grandparents went through a traumatic event, and that experience somehow affected their biology in a way that was passed down to their descendants, ultimately shaping how their great-grandchildren, perhaps even you, respond to stress or trauma. The idea that emotional predispositions might be genetically passed down in this way opens up new possibilities for how we understand mental health, emotional resilience, and even emotional challenges like anxiety, depression, or PTSD. The scientific underpinning of this idea can be found in a relatively new field of study called Epigenetics. Explores how external factors such as life experiences, environmental influences, and stress can cause changes in gene expression without altering the underlying DNA sequence itself. While our DNA remains largely the same throughout our lives, epigenetic changes can influence how our genes are expressed, affecting everything from physical traits to emotional and psychological responses. One of the most fascinating aspects of epigenetics is that these changes can be passed down to future generations. This means that the emotional experiences of our ancestors could potentially alter our genetic expression, predisposing us to certain emotional reactions or even mental health conditions. For example, a parent's traumatic experience might result in epigenetic modifications that affect their child's stress response system, making them more sensitive to anxiety or emotional distress. This mechanism could also work in the opposite direction, with positive emotional experiences such as love, support, and resilience potentially having a lasting, beneficial effect on future generations. What makes this concept even more intriguing is the idea that we might not even be aware of the genetic influences on our emotions. While we can clearly see the effects of our upbringing, our environment, and our personal experiences, the hidden influence of our genetic inheritance is much more subtle. The emotional responses that feel automatic, those knee-jerk reactions to stress, joy, anger, or fear, could be the result of deeply embedded genetic programming. In some cases, these inherited emotional predispositions might be in perfect alignment with our personal experiences, but in other cases, they might seem to come from nowhere. Have you ever found yourself reacting emotionally to a situation in a way that feels completely out of proportion to the event at hand? Perhaps you've experienced a sudden surge of anger or fear, even when the situation didn't seem to warrant such a response. These moments might not be entirely explained by your current life experiences, but rather by deeper, inherited emotional patterns that have been passed down from generations before you. The emotional responses you are experiencing could be a result of ancestral memories encoded in your genes, memories that influence how you process emotions, even if you've never personally experienced the events that originally triggered those reactions. Research on epigenetics is still in its early stages, but there have already been some groundbreaking studies that suggest a genetic basis for emotional responses. One of the most well-known studies involves the effects of trauma on the descendants of Holocaust survivors. Scientists have found that the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are more likely to experience heightened levels of stress, anxiety, and depression, even if they were not directly exposed to the traumatic events that their ancestors endured. This phenomenon is believed to be the result of epigenetic changes that were passed down through generations, potentially altering the way the stress response system functions in these individuals. Similar findings have been observed in other populations who have experienced generational trauma, such as the descendants of slaves, war veterans, and survivors of natural disasters. These studies suggest that trauma can leave an imprint on our genes, affecting how we process and respond to emotional stimuli. It also suggests that emotional resilience or vulnerability could be shaped not just by our personal experiences, but by the experiences of those who came before us. What makes this research even more compelling is the idea that emotional inheritance doesn't only apply to negative experiences. Just as trauma can leave an imprint on our genetic code, positive emotional experiences might also be passed down through generations. In fact, some studies suggest that the emotional health of our ancestors, particularly the ways they dealt with stress, love, and adversity, could influence our own emotional well-being. For instance, if your great-grandparents had a strong sense of community, a healthy support system, and a positive outlook on life, it's possible that these emotional traits could be encoded in your genetic makeup, giving you a stronger foundation for emotional resilience. Likewise, if your ancestors had positive experiences with relationships, love, and connection, it's plausible that these emotional patterns could influence your ability to form healthy, secure relationships as an adult. In this way, emotional inheritance may not only predispose us to stress or trauma, but also to positive emotions like joy, love, and fulfillment. The implications of this research extend far beyond our understanding of individual emotions. If our emotional responses are influenced by genetic inheritance, it could radically change the way we approach mental health and emotional well-being. Traditional approaches to therapy and emotional healing often focus on changing our behavior or thought patterns, with the assumption that our emotional responses are shaped primarily by our personal experiences. But what if our emotional reactions are rooted in something deeper, something that goes beyond our conscious awareness? What if, in addition to addressing current life experiences, we also need to consider the inherited emotional patterns that may be influencing our reactions? This would mean that healing emotional wounds might involve more than just understanding our own life story. It might also involve understanding the emotional history of our families and ancestors. Furthermore, the concept of emotional inheritance could also change the way we think about mental health conditions. If certain emotional predispositions are passed down through generations, it might explain why certain conditions such as anxiety, depression, or PTSD run in families. These conditions may not just be the result of personal experiences, but could also be influenced by genetic factors that predispose individuals to certain emotional responses. Recognizing the role of emotional inheritance in mental health could help reduce stigma around mental health conditions and open the door to new forms of treatment that address both personal and ancestral factors. In the coming years, as research into epigenetics and emotional inheritance continues to unfold, we may gain a much deeper understanding of how our emotions are shaped by both our personal experiences and the emotional legacies of our ancestors. It may even lead to new approaches in therapy, healing, and emotional well-being, offering a more holistic view of how we experience and respond to the world around us. Ultimately, this concept forces us to rethink the way we view emotions as isolated, individual experiences, but as part of a much larger, interconnected web of biological, familial, and societal influences that stretch across generations. The idea of emotional inheritance may seem revolutionary today, but its roots stretch far back into the history of both genetics and psychology. For centuries, emotions were thought to be shaped almost entirely by the environment. Before the advent of modern genetics, the prevailing belief was that the emotional responses we had, whether to fear, love, or stress, were almost entirely products of our immediate surroundings, socialization, and learned behaviors. Theories of human emotion have evolved considerably over time, influenced by a long-standing debate between the forces of nature and nurture, or, in more contemporary terms, biology and environment. Charles Darwin, the father of evolutionary theory, was one of the first to recognize that emotions played a key role in human survival, though he focused more on their biological purpose than on their genetic inheritance. His groundbreaking work, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, 1872, suggested that emotions were deeply rooted in evolutionary survival mechanisms, designed to help humans react quickly to life-threatening situations. Darwin saw emotions as essential, universal responses that evolved to promote survival across species. While Darwin was instrumental in showing that emotions have biological roots, the prevailing thought of his time still adhered largely to the idea that emotional responses were shaped by individual life experiences rather than inherited genetic factors. Early psychological theories in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly those of Sigmund Freud and Ivan Pavlov, delved into the understanding of emotions and their origins. Freud's theories of psychoanalysis suggested that our emotional life was heavily influenced by early childhood experiences and unconscious desires, often shaped by our parents, caregivers, and formative experiences. Freud famously argued that much of our emotional life is buried in the unconscious mind, and that repressed emotions from early childhood could resurface later in life, often causing emotional distress. In contrast, Pavlov, through his famous experiments with dogs, introduced the concept of classical conditioning, which demonstrated that emotional responses could be learned, reinforcing the idea that behavior and emotions were primarily shaped by external stimuli and experiences. These early psychological theories contributed to the dominant belief that emotions were primarily learned, shaped by one's environment, and could change over time through experience and social conditioning. However, the question of whether emotions could also be biologically inherited was rarely considered. For much of the 20th century, the debate continued to center around nature versus nurture, whether our emotional makeup was determined by our genetic inheritance or shaped more by our upbringing and environment. The real breakthrough in understanding the potential genetic basis for emotions didn't come until the late 20th and early 21st centuries with the discovery of epigenetics, a field that would completely challenge the traditional nature versus nurture debate. Epigenetics, which literally means above genetics, refers to changes in gene expression that are influenced by environmental factors without altering the underlying DNA sequence itself. In other words, while our genetic code remains largely fixed, our genes can be switched on or off in response to external influences, including life experiences. This concept has opened the door to understanding how the environment, including personal experiences, trauma, stress, or even nutrition, can shape how genes are expressed, affecting everything from physical traits to emotional responses. The discovery of epigenetics has profound implications for how we understand emotional inheritance. The field suggests that emotional responses may not be purely the result of learned behavior or experiences, but could also be influenced by genetic expression that has been altered by previous generations' experiences. One of the most powerful examples of this can be seen in studies on trauma. For instance, research has shown that survivors of extreme trauma such as war veterans or victims of abuse can pass on certain stress-related gene expressions to their descendants. These changes can influence the way their children and grandchildren react to stress, even if they have never personally experienced the same trauma. This notion that past generations' experiences could be imprinted in the DNA of their descendants is a central tenet of epigenetics, and suggests that emotional responses may, in fact, be inherited in ways we never imagined. The study of epigenetics has brought an entirely new lens to mental health, addiction, and trauma, where the concept of emotional inheritance is becoming increasingly relevant. Researchers are now exploring how the emotional experiences of past generations, whether positive or negative, may be embedded in our genetic code, affecting how we handle emotions such as stress, anxiety, and fear. In cases of addiction, for example, there is growing evidence that the emotional experiences of one's ancestors could influence susceptibility to addictive behaviors. If an ancestor had a history of substance abuse or emotional trauma, it might change how their descendants' brains respond to certain stressors or substances, making them more vulnerable to similar issues. This kind of research is beginning to reshape the way we view addiction, no longer as a purely individual issue, but as one that may involve a complex interplay of genetic, environmental, and ancestral factors. The impact of emotional inheritance is especially evident in the context of trauma. Historical studies have shown that traumatic events such as war, slavery, or genocide can leave lasting emotional imprints that affect not just the survivors, but also their descendants. One of the most famous studies in this regard involves Holocaust survivors and their descendants. Researchers have found that children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors often show higher levels of stress and anxiety, even though they were not directly exposed to the traumatic events. This suggests that the traumatic experiences of previous generations could be encoded in the genetic makeup of their descendants, leading to a heightened sensitivity to stress and trauma. In similar studies, the descendants of African slaves in the United States, as well as those of indigenous populations who suffered through colonization, have been found to exhibit higher rates of emotional and psychological distress, possibly due to the inherited effects of generational trauma. The discovery of emotional inheritance has significant implications for the way we approach psychological treatment and addiction recovery. Traditionally, therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT) and psychoanalysis have focused on an individual's past experiences and personal history as the primary drivers of emotional responses. However, as the field of epigenetics advances, it's becoming increasingly clear that emotional healing may need to consider not only an individual's experiences but also the emotional history of their family and ancestors. For instance, treating someone with anxiety or depression might involve understanding not just their current life circumstances, but also how their ancestors' emotional experiences, perhaps even those they're unaware of, could be influencing their emotional responses today. Furthermore, the concept of emotional inheritance could lead to new treatment paradigms for addiction recovery. If we begin to understand that addiction may be influenced by both personal experiences and inherited emotional patterns, treatment approaches might need to be more holistic. This could involve exploring family histories of addiction, trauma, or mental health issues, and addressing the intergenerational emotional patterns that may be contributing to current struggles. For example, a person in recovery from addiction might benefit not only from individual therapy but also from family-based therapies that help address the emotional legacy of their ancestors. The therapeutic focus could shift from purely individual behaviors to a broader understanding of the emotional patterns that have been passed down through generations. What's at stake with the discovery of emotional inheritance is profound. If emotional responses, particularly those related to stress, trauma, and mental health, are indeed encoded in our genes and passed down through generations, it could dramatically change the way we view and treat psychological issues. Understanding that our emotional experiences are not only shaped by our immediate surroundings, but also by the emotional histories of our ancestors, opens up a new dimension of treatment and prevention. Mental health professionals might need to incorporate genetic and familial histories into their assessments, acknowledging that the effects of past generations' emotional experiences could be just as influential as a person's current life experiences. This shift in perspective could lead to more personalized and effective treatments, as well as a deeper understanding of the complex factors that shape human emotions. Moreover, this research could have broader societal implications. If emotional inheritance is real, it could challenge us to rethink how we address historical traumas and collective emotional burdens. Communities that have been historically marginalized or oppressed, such as indigenous peoples, African Americans, or refugees, find that their emotional distress is not only a result of current inequities but also a legacy of intergenerational trauma. Societal efforts to heal these wounds might need to include more than just addressing present-day inequalities. They may also need to acknowledge and heal the emotional scars left by centuries of collective trauma. By recognizing the emotional inheritance passed down through generations, we can begin to build a more comprehensive approach to healing and well-being, both at the individual and societal levels. 3. In conclusion, the concept of emotional inheritance is not just a theoretical construct, but a rapidly developing area of research that is reshaping how we think about emotions, trauma, mental health, and healing. With the advent of epigenetics, we are beginning to understand that our emotional lives are shaped not just by our own experiences but by the collective emotional history of our ancestors. This realization has the potential to revolutionize psychological treatment, addiction recovery, and societal healing, offering a new lens through which we can view and address the emotional challenges of the present. What's at stake is not just a new understanding of human emotions, but the possibility of a more integrated and holistic approach to mental health and emotional well-being. ChatGPT said, in the early 21st century, a groundbreaking study shifted the conversation about emotional inheritance from speculative theory to scientifically validated reality. In 2013, a team of researchers from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York published a study that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the relationship between trauma, genetics, and emotional behavior. Their findings were startling. They had discovered that traumatic experiences, particularly those related to severe stress and fear, could leave molecular marks on our DNA, marks that could then be passed down to future generations, potentially influencing their emotional responses. This landmark study, which looked at mice exposed to traumatic experiences, revealed that the offspring of these mice exhibited heightened fear responses, even though they had never been exposed to the original traumatic event. The study found that the trauma experienced by the parent mice resulted in specific changes in gene expression in the brain, changes that were then inherited by their descendants. This discovery was revolutionary, as it suggested that the impact of trauma could extend far beyond the immediate survivors. The concept that trauma could leave a lasting molecular imprint on the DNA, affecting subsequent generations' emotional health, was a mind-bending idea, one that brought a new level of complexity to our understanding of how emotions are inherited. Researchers had long known that genetic factors could influence susceptibility to conditions like depression, anxiety, and PTSD, but this was different. This study suggested that the very experience of trauma, rather than just genetic predisposition, be passed down, altering how future generations experienced emotions like fear and stress. The revelation didn't stop there. Following up on this research, a 2018 study led by Dr. Rachel Yehuda, a leading researcher in PTSD and trauma, examined the descendants of Holocaust survivors. Yehuda's team found that the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors had different stress hormone levels compared to the general population, indicating that the emotional consequences of trauma could be inherited. More remarkably, Yehuda's research demonstrated that genetic changes linked to trauma could be observed in survivors' descendants, even if they had not personally experienced the original event. This finding hinted at the possibility that complex behavioral patterns, such as vulnerability to anxiety or heightened stress response, might be encoded in genes not just as a predisposition but as a direct consequence of trauma. The implications of these discoveries are profound and deeply unsettling. The genetic code, once thought to be a relatively static blueprint for our physical traits, is now understood to be far more dynamic and responsive to life experiences than previously imagined. For centuries, we've accepted that emotions like fear, anxiety, or love are shaped primarily by our environment and upbringing. Now, with the emerging field of epigenetics, scientists have shown that these complex emotional responses could also be biologically encoded, passed down from one generation to the next. It's as if our genetic makeup is more of a living document, continually being edited by the events we endure, the traumas we face, and the life experiences we have. And these edits aren't just personal, they can affect our children, our grandchildren, and perhaps even future generations who have never known the original source of their inherited emotional responses. But this new understanding of emotional inheritance creates a dilemma, one that complicates our sense of free will, mental health, and identity. If emotions, especially negative ones like anxiety, depression, or PTSD, are genetically encoded and passed down through generations, what does this mean for the concept of personal choice? The realization that our emotional responses may be deeply influenced by genetic factors can feel liberating in some ways. It may offer an explanation for why certain people are more prone to certain emotional states, why some people are more resilient while others seem to struggle with the same issues. In this light, understanding that emotional predispositions are not merely the result of individual shortcomings but are rooted in biology, could provide a sense of compassion and empathy for those suffering from mental health conditions. However, this discovery also introduces a sense of fatalism. If our emotions are partially pre-programmed by our ancestors' experiences, do we truly have the ability to change them? Can we break free from the inherited emotional patterns that may dictate our responses to stress, love, fear, or trauma. What happens to our sense of personal responsibility and agency if we are, in some ways, prisoners of our biological inheritance? If we are predisposed to certain emotional responses because of the trauma experienced by our ancestors, how much control do we really have over our own emotional health and identity? This dilemma extends far beyond theoretical questions. It has real-world implications for mental health treatment, addiction recovery, and societal well-being. If emotional conditions like PTSD, anxiety, and depression are encoded in our genetic makeup, what does that mean for those seeking therapy or healing? Will treatment now need to address not only personal experiences but also the inherited emotional legacies of past generations? Therapies that focus solely on the individual's present-day experiences may not be enough. If we acknowledge that emotions like fear and anxiety could be the result of inherited genetic changes that are beyond our control. Moreover, the discovery that trauma can leave molecular marks on our DNA complicates the way we think about generational trauma. In the past, understanding trauma in the context of history and family dynamics was often framed as a psychological issue. Children of abuse victims, for example, were seen as having learned emotional responses based on their experiences growing up. Now, with the epigenetic understanding of emotional inheritance, the emotional scars left by traumatic events could be seen as more than learned behavior. They may be biological markers, passed down through generations, affecting those who were never part of the original event. This forces us to reconsider the broader implications of societal trauma, like war, slavery, colonization, and genocide. If the emotional responses to these events are embedded in the genetic code, the effects of such historical events could be far more pervasive and enduring than previously understood. Perhaps one of the most troubling aspects of this discovery is the challenge it poses to the concept of free will. If trauma, stress, and anxiety are encoded in our genes and passed down from generation to generation, where does personal choice fit in? Free will has long been a cornerstone of our moral and philosophical frameworks. The idea that we are responsible for our actions and emotions, that we can choose how to respond to life's challenges, is foundational to how we think about ourselves and others. But if our emotional responses are shaped not just by our own experiences but by the traumatic experiences of our ancestors, then our sense of control over our emotional lives seems less certain. Are we free to change, or are we doomed to repeat the emotional patterns of our forebears? At the same time, this new understanding of emotional inheritance may offer hope. The discovery that trauma can leave marks on our genes is not just a revelation about our biological limitations, it also opens the door to new possibilities for healing. If emotional responses are encoded in our genetic makeup, then it may be possible to alter those genetic expressions through targeted interventions, therapies, and lifestyle changes. Just as we have learned to treat physical diseases through genetic therapies, it's conceivable that we might one day be able to address inherited emotional conditions at a genetic level, offering new hope for people struggling with conditions like PTSD, anxiety, and depression. Moreover, understanding that we may be carrying emotional legacies from our ancestors could inspire a greater sense of empathy, both for ourselves and for others. Instead of viewing mental health struggles as individual failures, we might come to see them as part of a larger, intergenerational pattern that can be addressed collectively. In the face of this discovery, we are left with a deep, existential question. How do we reconcile our newfound understanding of genetic emotional inheritance with our beliefs in personal agency, healing, and free will? Do we embrace the hope that comes with the possibility of genetic modification and therapeutic intervention, or do we resign ourselves to the idea that we are forever shaped by the emotional experiences of our ancestors? It wasn't just trauma, anxiety, or fear that could be encoded into our DNA and passed down through generations. Positive emotions like emotional resilience, happiness, and even optimism could be inherited as well. The revelation came as a surprise to many, challenging the widely held belief that only negative emotional patterns are passed down. While much of the early research on emotional inheritance focused on the darker side of human experience, trauma, fear, and stress, recent studies began to reveal that positive emotional traits could also have genetic roots. Just as trauma could leave a mark on the DNA, so too could joy, love, and resilience. For example, a study published in 2020 by Dr. Richard Davidson, a leading researcher on emotions and the brain, found that certain positive emotional traits, such as compassion and emotional resilience, could be inherited through epigenetic mechanisms. Davidson's research demonstrated that people who had grown up in supportive, loving environments, particularly those who had received emotional support from parents or caregivers, exhibited higher levels of empathy and emotional regulation that were, in some cases, passed down to their children. This study raised the possibility that emotional resilience could be encoded just as easily as emotional distress, offering a more balanced view of the emotional inheritance landscape. This was a game changer. It suggested that our emotional blueprint is not purely a legacy of suffering or adversity, but a complex mixture of both positive and negative experiences encoded in our genes. In other words, just as a family history of addiction, depression, or trauma can leave a mark on the DNA, so too can a legacy of emotional strength, joy, and even hope. The idea that we could inherit a predisposition for happiness, emotional balance, and resilience shifted the narrative away from fatalism and into the realm of possibility. It hinted that we might not only be inheriting the wounds of our ancestors but also the potential for healing, growth, and emotional flourishing. But this discovery also unveiled a paradox. While emotional traits, both positive and negative, indeed inherited, humans also possess a unique ability to rewrite their emotional genetic legacy. Through conscious choices, lifestyle changes, mindfulness practices, and therapeutic interventions, we can alter how our genes express themselves. This finding upended the deterministic view that we are bound by our genetic inheritance. If emotional responses can be both inherited and modified, then it follows that we are not entirely at the mercy of our biology. We possess the capacity to rewrite the emotional script that has been passed down through generations. That this genetic paradox that we are both shaped by and capable of changing our emotional inheritance was illustrated through the story of Emma, a woman who grew up in a family marked by generational trauma. Emma's grandparents had survived the horrors of war, and her parents, while loving, struggled with anxiety and depression, emotional scars from their own upbringing. Emma was diagnosed with severe anxiety in her early 20s and felt trapped by the same emotional patterns she saw in her parents. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was destined to repeat the cycles of fear and stress that had been handed down to her. But after years of struggling, she decided to seek therapy and engage in mindfulness practices. Emma's journey was transformative. Over the course of several years, she learned how to reframe her emotional responses to stress and anxiety. She discovered that her emotional reactions were not inevitable, that with the right tools, she could change how she responded to triggers. Through mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, and a supportive community, Emma was able to break free from the emotional patterns that had defined her family's history. And as she healed, she noticed something remarkable. Her relationship with her children was different. They seemed less anxious, more resilient, and more emotionally balanced than she had been at their age. It wasn't that they were immune to emotional struggles, but the patterns of anxiety and fear that had once been passed down through generations were no longer as pronounced. Emma had rewritten her family's emotional blueprint, altering the genetic legacy she had inherited. Emma's story is not unique. Research increasingly suggests that individuals can influence the expression of their emotional genes through lifestyle choices, therapy, and intentional emotional growth. This represents a personal revolution. The ability to change not just one's own emotional trajectory but the emotional trajectory of an entire family line. What seemed like an irreversible chain of inherited emotional traits passed down through generations, like an unbreakable link in the genetic chain, was suddenly revealed to be more flexible than anyone had imagined. Through conscious effort, people like Emma were proving that emotional inheritance was not a fatalistic curse, but a dynamic process that could be transformed. This realization offered a sense of hope and agency that had previously been absent from the conversation about emotional inheritance. If we are not merely victims of our genetic emotional legacy but active participants in shaping it, then the possibilities for healing and growth become boundless. The narrative of inherited emotional trauma can shift from one of helplessness to one of empowerment. Instead of feeling trapped by the emotional patterns of our ancestors, we can see ourselves as part of a living, evolving family story, a story that we have the power to influence and change. The twist in this narrative that emotional resilience and happiness could be encoded in the DNA, and that humans can rewrite their emotional genetic legacy challenges our understanding of what it means to be human. It pushes back against the deterministic view of genetic inheritance, offering instead a vision of emotional evolution, one where we are not bound by our biology but capable of rewriting it. This discovery offers a profound sense of possibility, showing that we can break the chains of inherited emotional struggles and build a new legacy, one rooted in emotional resilience, hope, and well-being. It is, at its core, a call to embrace our agency and take responsibility for not just our own emotional futures, but the emotional futures of those who come after us today. The science of emotional inheritance has undergone a remarkable transformation, largely thanks to the breakthroughs in epigenetics. Epigenetics, the study of how environmental factors and life experiences influence gene expression, has provided profound insights into how our emotional traits are shaped and, more importantly, how they can be altered. We now understand that our genes are not fixed blueprints. Rather, they are dynamic, constantly influenced by the world around us. This means that emotional predispositions, such as susceptibility to anxiety, depression, or resilience, can be encoded in our DNA, not as fixed traits, but as flexible patterns that can be shaped by our experiences. As a result, the science of emotional inheritance is no longer about simply recognizing the inheritance of trauma, but also about recognizing the potential for healing and transformation embedded within our genetic code. Epigenetic research has expanded our ability to predict and even treat mental health disorders by targeting genetic predispositions. For example, scientists have discovered that trauma experienced by one generation can leave molecular marks on the DNA that influence the emotional responses of subsequent generations. These changes don't alter the genetic code itself but modify how certain genes are expressed. In the case of PTSD, researchers have found that the descendants of trauma survivors, such as those who lived through wars or genocides, may carry altered stress response pathways in their genetic makeup. However, these changes are not permanent. They can be influenced by interventions, such as therapy, mindfulness practices, or changes in environment, which can turn off the genes that predispose individuals to anxiety or depression. This has opened the door to more personalized and precise approaches to mental health treatment, where interventions are tailored to the individual's genetic and epigenetic profile, offering new hope for those who previously felt trapped by their inherited emotional patterns. The emerging field of epigenetic therapy is at the forefront of this new approach to mental health. Epigenetic therapy focuses on using scientific insights into how our genes are affected by life experiences to treat emotional and psychological disorders. One of the core ideas behind epigenetic therapy is that therapeutic interventions, whether through psychotherapy, medication, lifestyle changes, or even mindfulness practices, can help reprogram the way genes are expressed, effectively breaking the cycle of inherited emotional struggles. For example, a person who experiences trauma may undergo therapy designed to alter their physiological stress response, thereby reducing the genetic expression of anxiety and fear. In this way, epigenetic therapy goes beyond traditional methods that focus solely on managing symptoms. It targets the root cause, how emotional patterns are encoded in our genes, allowing individuals to change their emotional responses at a genetic level. This approach is also opening new possibilities in treating conditions like addiction, depression, and even post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which have historically been seen as deeply rooted in both genetic predisposition and environmental factors. The key to these new therapies is the understanding that emotions and their biological underpinnings are not set in stone.